going to be doing a brief overview of historical sources or ideas about sources of power historically. So what the Milgram experiment showed aligns with the findings of the authors of Nexus and of network theorists in general, that how we are connected and how we are emplaced within historical or social structures indicates things for how we behave, how we perceive and know our place in relation to others, and ultimately how we experience ourselves. So some of the questions that we're going to be needing to ask in this class is, what are the situations in which we find ourselves? So for this week's task, when we're beginning to think about power on social media or power in general in the digital sphere, we're going to be thinking about the kinds of situations in which we find ourselves and the sorts of power and implications for power that means. And we'll get into that a little bit more broadly just shortly. So historical sources of power. In the era that's generally known as Premodern, and that can mean many, many things, from ancient history to feudal times prior to the Middle Ages. It can even mean the Middle Ages sometimes, but we're going to basically describe the period up until the Enlightenment. There were various different ideas about culture and about power. And of course, these ideas are culturally specific. And I'm going to be talking about the Judeo-Christian and Western tradition mostly, but we'll also occasionally be thinking about other aspects of power as well. Now, when I say the Western tradition, we need to understand that doesn't mean the West as we today conceive of it, that the Judeo-Christian tradition extends, of course, to the Middle East. But in biblical times, so we're talking about the era in which the Abrahamic prophets were writing the first books of what later became known in the Christian tradition as the Old Testament of the Bible. There was a sense that power only came from above. It was divinely attributed by God. And in order to receive that power, you had to receive it from the gods. And often there were powerful people who were regarded as having access to those gods, to hearing from God. And they would often receive or claim to receive instructions about who the leader was meant to be. And they would literally anoint this leader, usually through a ceremony, and also by oil, by touching the forehead with oil. And people who could have access to the divine were known as prophets. And they had various sources of hearing from the divine, whether that was literally acoustically hearing or through dreams or various other means. Of course, we're talking about a society that was, for the most part, pre-literate. So these were kind of, for want of a better word, magical instructions that they would receive about who a given leader of society was meant to be. And so in the Abrahamic tradition, the Judaic Christian tradition, Abraham was literally instructed by God, or he claims to have been, that he was to create a people who would follow the one and only God that he had heard from. And his tribe was a tribe of Jews, and he was promised by God that this tribe would become so numerous that it would be as many as the stars in the sky and cover all of the lands of the earth. So in the early tribal organization of the Abrahamic tradition, there were patriarchs. Abraham, of course, was one of them. And that was where power obviously came from. Law was, of course, another source of power. And Moses, when he went up to Mount Sinai and received directly from God, he claims, the instructions about how to set about his society, the 10 Commandments, that was the beginning of their social structure and their law. And so, of course, there was power around that, power if you obeyed that, and power if you enforced that. And subsequently to that, as the Abrahamic tradition expanded, there were then, of course, other people who were patriarchs, other leaders of the religion who were able also to add to that. So the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament is a book that has something like 666 laws of, there we go, there were number 6 again, of how somebody who was following that tradition should live their life. And it was very detailed, everything from, not eating seafood not eating the animals of the field that had cloven hoofs, various other things that now may seem to us very bizarre. But we need to remember that this was before the rise of the nation state, and this was before there was the first secular constitution, the Magna Carta. That was many years later. It was certainly before the rise of nation states as we know them now, like Australia or England, certainly even before the rise of empires as we know them. So this, for the Abrahamic society, was their law, and following it was a way to keep safe. It was a way to keep healthy. It was a way to ensure that as your people became more populous, as Abraham was promised, that you would not be at risk of disease, which often does happen to populations when they grow, because there were not known laws around sanitation. There wasn't a sanitation system. And where there are many people gathering, there are many germs. There was no germ theory back then. And so many of these laws were about trying to fulfill the promise that Abraham believed that he was given, which was to grow a society that would be as numerous as all of the stars in the sky. From that, people began to ask for kings to organize them. So you can see in the beginning, kings weren't seen as despots, but they were actually seen as protectors, and people who could organize society. And of course, there was the very beginning of a juridical system in judges as well. And the judges were there to interpret and follow the law. And so in very ancient times, this was important, usually for people's safety. And when we perceive it through our modern day lens, we can kind of think it's quite unjust. It's often very male oriented. It often would seem quite racist to us because it was a society like many ancient societies that believed in the holding of slaves. And it is quite ethnocentric in the way that you can see, if you read these old laws, the way in which they thought about other tribes that were not their own. Their laws were for their tribe, for the tribe of the Jews. And you can see as well that there were very clear ideas about sexuality that have become contended and contentious much later on in contemporary society. And those laws were for various reasons as well. You could follow theological interpretations, and there are many academics of theology who have various explanations for why there were those laws and taboos around sexuality. But for the most part, these laws and this power that was invested in particular leaders was regarded as beneficial, as beneficent, as a way to protect society. And as Western society grew in other ways and we developed feudalism, there was a similar sort of sense that the lord of the manor would be the protector, generally the benevolent protector. Everybody living within the walls of that feudal society would be protected by the king from invaders. They would be fairly given food. It would be distributed amongst people, and they would be looked after in return for giving a portion of what they grew in their agricultural produce to the king, who would then dispense that from his larder. And that idea of exchange and of giving tribute also has its roots in ancient society and can be seen in the Abrahamic tradition through the idea of a tithe, that one would give 10% of what they earned to the church. And the idea, at least in theory, was that the church would then, or the temple as it was called then, would be able to protect people. Okay, so we often these days, I think, have an idea that power is despotic, that power is top down, and that especially when we reinterpret ancient documents and ancient ideas about power through contemporary eyes, we often have a sense that it's just unjust, especially since we have much more democratic ideas and we have various different institutions within the state that organize how we live our lives. So it may seem to us overarching that in Leviticus, there's all of these laws, and some of them are to do with diet, and some of them are to do with sexuality, and some of them are to do with marriage laws, and various other things. But we have divided society now into a sense where there are different areas, perhaps of your local government, your state government, your national federal government, and of your religion, and we kind of accord different branches of government different powers. And we like to keep them separate, but we can see sometimes, particularly, I think, in intensified ways these days, in the days of COVID, where sometimes these powers also get muddled, or they can conflict with one another. We also can see these days where we've inherited some of these ancient ideas about power, particularly through religious institutions, that they can sometimes come in conflict with modern ideas about divisions of power in a nation state. So there's some ancient ideas of power. As we progressed from medieval society to early modern society, so early modern society is generally characterized as the period of Shakespeare. And if you're in Dr. Claire Hanson's class, I think it's called Remaking Shakespeare, you'd be learning about the early modern period right now, which is generally around the 1600s. Medieval period is about something that begins about the year 1000 and extends to about 1600. And pervasive through this period was something that we had still inherited from these ancient Abrahamic ideas. And that's largely because this was a society that was only beginning to see the rise of something that we would now recognize as the modern nation state. The world wasn't organized the way that we see geography now. It's very interesting to look at historical atlases and recognize that things that we now see and take for granted as the country of France or the country of Germany or the country of Turkey or the country of Laos or the country of Uganda or the country of Canada, where I'm from, were of course not called that then. During the medieval period, we saw, of course, duchies. We saw the beginning of dynasties. We saw the beginning of the Habsburg dynasty. We saw trade exchanges and various other things that later became precursors to the nation state. But for the foremostly, the world was divided into Christendom and not. That was the way that people would think about geography back in the medieval to the early modern period. There was Christendom, and then there was the Occident. There was the Caliphate that was generally Muslim, and that was the circumference of the world. But within Christendom, which we would now perhaps say is something that extended through most of the West, but of course it also penetrated Middle East and North Africa. There was this inherited idea from the Abrahamic tradition that power was still divinely accorded. But as we progressed through these epistemes that Foucault talked about and that we addressed last week, they became categorized and they started to become ordered. And so people had this idea of at the very top of the great chain of being, there was God, and then of course there was angels or demons, heaven, humans were sort of in the middle of the chain of being, beasts, plants, fire, and stone. So it might seem to us quite random now, but this made a lot of sense to people in that world, in that episteme. But of course, this led to abuses of power. So where at the beginning, perhaps the idea was that a king would be a protector and benevolent, we can see, for instance, at the rise of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, which was not long after the period of Shakespeare, so the French Revolution in 1789 and the American Revolution in 1776, people were rebelling against what they saw as despotic leaders, despotic sovereigns at that time. And the sovereign was no longer seen as somebody who would necessarily protect them. They were people who amassed wealth and did not equally distribute it through society. So this meme here, let them eat cake, we know that would generally refer to, of course, Marie Antoinette, who, when she was told that the people in the streets of Paris, that the commoners were starving, she just sort of said to them, well, there's bread, they can just eat that. They don't need fancy foodstuffs. And what she didn't understand, of course, was that people didn't even have access to that. And of course, this led to early ideas about democracy, the storming of the Bastille, and the rise of the nation state. The modern state, of course, also comes from other ancient ideas, particularly in Plato's ideal society. He wrote a very famous book called, and you've probably heard of it before, The Republic. And in The Republic, he was setting out, again, kind of like Moses did and the early Abrahamic fathers did, but in another tradition, he was setting out what he thought were ideals for how the ideal society should be run. Okay, and we of course need to remember that in this particular period of society, whilst it was seen as a democracy, or at least the prototype to modern democracy, that it wasn't, of course, enfranchising everybody. Women were not allowed to vote. People who were not citizens of the city-state of Athens, so these were not nations or empires, it was just a city-state, fairly small population comparatively, but we're talking about people who managed. You had to be a free citizen, and you couldn't be a slave. It was, again, very ethnocentric, so you couldn't be a non-Greek person. And you had to be a man of a particular age, and you had to be educated enough to participate in democracy. And so we talked about how the trivium, or the very sort of basic curriculum or syllabus that now undergirds the modern universities, Bachelor of Arts or Liberal Arts program, actually came from this period. And they believed that the most important things for people to be educated in, to be able to participate in democracy, so that it wasn't just mob rule, but informed rule, was logic, ethos, pathos, and kairos. And those are words that generally refer to the graduate attributes that we now impart to our students. Logos meaning the ability to logically reason, critically analyze. Ethos is an interesting one, but it tends to be translated to something like power or status. People respect, as we saw in Stanley Milgram's Obedience to Authority study, even today, people who are invested in power. And so if you come out with a degree and you're a Bachelor of Arts or a Master's of Arts or a Bachelor of Planning or whatever degree you might be enrolled in following along with this subject, you know that when you come out with that degree, it gives you a certain credibility, and ethos perhaps translates best to credibility. So you need to be a credible source of some kind of authority that people will respect. And arguably, as we'll get on later into the subject, into the content of the subject, we may discuss about how sources of credibility or sources of authority may be changing in today's society, where perhaps we're now seeing people question the idea of the expert. And we're certainly seeing that in the way in which people are respecting or not respecting legal programs around the management of COVID, or even ideas about its source and how to contain it. But this is skipping ahead. We'll get to that later. Pathos is something perhaps that since the Enlightenment period, we haven't taken as seriously, at least in the academy, but pathos meant how you can move people. And so it's related to the word pathetic. Something that would be pathetic wouldn't be necessarily in the way we talk it now as something, and again, you can see the attitudes of the Enlightenment come through, that we think something pathetic now is something to be dismissed. But back then, pathos was more to do with how you move someone, how you impassion somebody to action. And we can also see in social media the rise of pathos again. And for those of us in the creative arts and humanities, or if we're involved in writing or art, we understand the power to move people. And that the power to move people is just as important as logic, perhaps. And one thing that quite often isn't remembered anymore in our society post-Enlightenment is that Greeks also thought that kairos was a very important thing for people to learn about. And that was partly around timing. It was about saying the right thing in the right way when, keeping your mouth shut, knowing when to speak, and knowing the right time to say things in a very measured and judicious way. And they educated people on that. And perhaps post-democratic society, in the era of keyboard warriors, were not quite so conscious about, there's a time to keep your mouth shut and there's a time to speak. And if you can obey that, then perhaps the timing of things will mean that you're more respected when you do speak. These ideas about how to govern were rediscovered in the Renaissance period, which briefly predated, but still ran through the period in which Shakespeare was writing in the early modern period. And it was a period in which those in the Holy Roman Empire, who had largely been dominated by religious ideas, began to rediscover the ideas of the ancient Greeks, and also the mathematics of the Muslims and other people who had made large contributions to early knowledge. It was also a period in which we can probably trace the rise of diplomacy. And of course, diplomats are characterized as people who have all of these attributes of being logical and authoritative, compassionate, knowing when to speak and how to speak. And ideas about how to govern, we can see also infuse writing in the Renaissance period by the very important author Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince. And quite often the word Machiavellian means, deceptive power, using sneaky tactics. But in fact, as one of your supplementary readings explains this week, that it wasn't exactly how Machiavelli wrote The Prince. He wrote it as a guidebook for how a prince could govern in ways to convince people, particularly in societies that were becoming quite complex and difficult to manage. So those are some ideas that kind of predate the rise of the modern nation state. And of course, if you're studying political history, you would understand that it is the modern nation state, since we saw all of those revolutions that occurred in the late 1700s that began to inform the way in which we structure power in society now. So the nation state is very, very new. The nation state only came out of those democratic revolutions in America in 1776 and in France in 1789. And then, of course, there were ripple effects throughout that. Arguably, England also went through a period that predates the American Revolution, a period of their civil war when people tried to take power away from the monarchy. They resolved things in England in a slightly different way than elsewhere. And if you study the English Civil War, you can follow that. It might be something that's touched on Rogers Gutenberg to Google's class. But the idea that power comes from the people is very new. If you think about time and timelines running from the advent of ancient history till the contemporary present of 2021, nation states have only been with us since the 1770s, and they've evolved in certain ways, and they were informed by very important Enlightenment thinkers. So you've probably heard of some of these thinkers: Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and they were very important Enlightenment thinkers, and they had ideas about the nature of power. Often, their ideas about the nature of power also derived from their conceptions of the nature of humans, so human nature. Hobbes was often characterized as somebody who talked about human nature and human life as nasty, brutish, and short. Now, you could say maybe he was a glass half full type of person, a bit of an Eeyore, but we need to remember the period in which these people were living was full of civil unrest. They were thinking, like Plato was, about how best to organize society, because society was so completely disorganized and in disarray at this time. And when you didn't have nationalized healthcare, you didn't have sanitation systems, you didn't have road systems, you didn't have national constitutions, there was a lot of anarchy, and that led to all kinds of things. It led to disease, it led to people dying early, much shorter lifespans than we would expect today. It led to warfare quite often between people who saw that they had a particular boundary under which their people lived and other people were encouraging on it. And so all of these explain why Hobbes would see the world that way. And so he believed that a sovereign should have unlimited power in order to be able to do things. And we can maybe understand that in today's society, even though, of course, we see it as despotic because of our democratic ideals. And we quite often associate that kind of unlimited power with fascism, with people like Hitler, for example, or Mussolini. And we think it's quite negative. But Hobbes was according a sovereign unlimited power because he just felt like, oh my goodness, things need to get done and organized. And of course, that idea that had been inherited from ancient history, that a sovereign would have unlimited power that was divine, meant that people would quite often respect